Hi, I'm Maggie.
And I'm Marin, and you're listening to Tell Me I'm Sorry, a podcast where we deconstruct and muse on depictions of girlhood in film, literature, and other media.
A feminist celebration of pop culture, the audacity of youth, and the ways we grow away from and into our bodies, beliefs, and dreams for ourselves and each other.
And today we are discussing
Makeup.
Directed and written by Claire Oakley. Released October 4th, 2019. This is a British film, so that is the UK release date. I could not find a US release date. And then we do have a poster tagline this week.
Oh.
Which was surprising to me, considering how small, in terms of, this movie's very independent, had a small release type movie. Are you ready?
I think so.
Devotion, suspicion, obsession.
I'm usually not a fan of taglines, so maybe I have some confirmation bias going on where I expect to not like them.
Yeah.
But I don't like it.
No, it's really bad. First, it made me think of the Ever After tagline, which is desire, defy, escape.
Yeah.
Those three one-word sentences in a row. And I was like, okay, so we're following that pattern, which does feel very 90s to me. I don't know if I'm thinking that simply because Ever After is a 90s movie, but something about that syntax.
The minimalist aspect of it is, 90s were all about, like, I feel like heroin chic was this fashion ideology almost, with an eye towards the minimal. So
there's a lot of spareness in this movie, but I also just think it fundamentally misrepresents the movie.
I agree. Obsession? I just don't, that's the word that I'm really hinging on.
Which, if that's the word that you're hinging on, then you're gonna love to read the logline that Google came up with, which is the only logline that exists for this movie. I found every single website I went to, it was this logline.
All right. Well, on a remote holiday park in Cornwall, a young woman is drawn into a mysterious obsession when she suspects her boyfriend has cheated on her. This film is so much deeper than that. It's so strange and enveloping, and there's this aspect of nostalgia where the light is constantly being like diffused either through rain or through it just being night, and you get like the street lamps. Is that the poster tagline for the UK too?
Well, I'm assuming, because it was the official poster I found on IMDb, and I'm assuming it was British people that came up with it.
I don't know why. I just expected more from them.
I wasn't surprised. And I think this log line is also fundamentally missing the point.
Yes. Yeah.
When you announced that we were watching this movie, my response was, I have literally never heard of this movie, which was true. And I told you that I wanted to go in as ignorant as possible. I wasn't going to look it up or anything before I watched it, which is exactly what I did. But still, when I pulled it up on the streaming service to watch it, this logline, I couldn't ignore it. So I still saw it right before I hit play.
Right.
And so then I went into the movie with that expectation, and then that expectation wasn't actually met because I don't really think this is what the movie is about. And so that kind of altered my viewing experience also, which I can get into later.
But there is this part of me that's like, well, the movie, it ends up being like this really beautiful rendering of queer coming of age. Mm-hmm. And I like that the logline, though, doesn't tell us that that's what it is.
Yeah.
So part of me is like, no, I kind of get it.
But is it straight baiting?
Maybe. And good. If it is, fucking good, dude. Watch this movie. I think we should bait the straights into watching gay stuff. Yeah, that's an agenda I can get behind.
That's true. Okay, much to consider, but before we go any further, I will provide my synopsis of the movie, which I tried my best, but this movie, like Maggie mentioned, is quite strange. There's lots of surreal elements to it. There are these questions of, is what this character is seeing real? Is it part of something happening in her head, something reflecting her deepest desires? So it's not the easiest film to describe in a straightforward way, but I will try my best. And of course, Maggie can fill in any gaps that I might potentially miss. Makeup follows Ruth, who is played by Molly Windsor. She is an 18-year-old girl who arrives at a seaside caravan park, which the U.S. equivalent term would be trailer park, probably, right? I just wasn't familiar with that term, caravan park, so I'm assuming it's a British.
Yeah, I think they refer to them as a van.
But she arrives at this caravan park to live with her boyfriend, whose name is Tom. He's played by Joseph Quinn, who you might recognize from Stranger Things. Yeah,
that's making sense now. Okay,
right.
Sorry. Go on. Yeah.
He works at this park, and when Ruth arrives, it's the off season, so winter is rolling in. The tourists have left. There's a lot of maintenance work to do after the tourists have left. Ruth plans to get a job at the park as well. And while cleaning the caravan that she and Tom are living in, she finds some stray red hairs on his clothing. And not having red hair herself, suspects Tom might have cheated on her, or he is spending time with some other woman in some way. She, meaning Ruth, meets the other employees at the park. Shirley, who's the owner / manager, a guy named Kai, who is stereotypically shitty and aggressive, and she meets another girl named Jade, who is quite enigmatic, I would say, and very enthralling to Ruth. You can tell immediately that Ruth is very drawn to Jade. And so Jade and Ruth, they grow closer. Jade gives Ruth a very emotionally charged manicure at one point. The two of them just spend a lot of time together in Jade's apartment. Jade also makes wigs, which becomes important because she has a red-haired wig that seems to match the hair that Ruth found on Tom's clothes. But Ruth also keeps seeing a girl with red hair in the distance when she's walking around the park. And this red-haired girl always suddenly disappears around a corner or through a doorway before Ruth can talk to her. And another aspect of the movie is that Ruth cannot swim, but the park is on the sea. She wants to overcome her fear of the water. She has some people who take her out on the water, and then at one point she goes swimming alone and she almost drowns, and while she's underwater she has these visions of the red-haired girl who we're not sure if she's real, if she's part of Ruth's imagination, if she's an extension of Ruth's desires. But Ruth and Tom grow distant. Ruth is clearly unhappy. Tom accuses Ruth of having feelings for Jade. She doesn't reciprocate when he says, "I love you" to her, and he lashes out very violently. He locks Ruth in their apartment, but Ruth escapes by breaking a window, and she goes to Jade's apartment, puts on a red wig, and heads down to a bonfire party where she sees Jade, and acting on her desires, kisses her. They sleep together on the beach. Ruth wakes up in Jade's bed the next morning, appears much happier, and then the film ends with Ruth confidently swimming by herself.
Those are all of the graspable elements of this film,
Yes.
for sure. Origin story?
Yes.
Okay.
You picked this movie.
So origin story with this movie, I just watched it sometime in 2020, which I imagine is the release date for the US. I don't know where I found it or why I watched it. I watch a lot of indie films, and I didn't know what I was about to watch, which is how I watch a lot of things. And I loved it. It feels like a poem. And some things feel very solidified in my mind about what's going on. But certainly someone else could experience it in such a different way, which I think is true for most things. The surreal nature of this film it's especially true in this case. But it almost felt like a bit of a fever dream. Sometimes when I watch independent films that are like atmospheric in the way that they're telling the story, I can't remember what they're called. And so I knew I wanted to do this film for the podcast. And to figure out what it was, I Googled something like queer coming of age girl helps other girl do nails and makeup, I think. And Google was like, oh, is this the film you're talking about? I was like, yes, I want to watch this again because there's so much about it I couldn't remember. You can't really put a pin in it. And now I wanted to do this podcast because I wanted to put those little pins in places and talk about them. So what about you?
Like I said earlier, I had not heard of this movie at all until Maggie asked me to watch it. I watched it twice, which I want to clarify that decision and explain the parts that went into that. Because one, the very first time I watched it, I ended up watching it over the course of 2 days because I thought I had time to watch the whole thing before I left to do something, and then I ran out of time. And so then I had to finish the last 20 minutes the next day, which I hate watching movies like that. And especially when you have to watch a movie in order to talk about it intelligently and coherently, that is not very conducive to doing that. And then I watched it a long time ago because we were initially going to record this episode at a different time that then ended up not working out. So there was a month and a half between when I first watched it and when we recorded this. So I was like, I need to watch it again. And then the third reason why I really wanted to watch it again was that I was not sure how I felt about this movie after watching it the first time. And I know like, the point of this podcast is not conversations about I liked or disliked X piece of art, but I was not sure if I liked this movie. So I rewatched it again last week. And the logline fucked me up too, I think. The logline created this expectation that then the movie wasn't going there, and so it was just a matter of readjusting my brain. So I wanted to rewatch it again, also knowing what exactly was going to happen, because I was like, this seems like the kind of movie, because it is so surreal, because it is so quiet and slower paced, that would benefit from revisiting it again, knowing what's happening so you can pick up on those smaller details. So, having watched it a second time, knowing what is going to happen, I still am kind of mixed on this movie. The directing is super strong. The atmosphere of the caravan park and with the sea in the background and the clouds overhead, it's so bleak in this really mundane way that I really like. And I appreciate so much the movie's commitment to being this very genre-defiant being that feels like a really clear and purposeful choice on Oakley's part. The way it's blending surreal imagery and body horror with also this tender coming-of-age romance, this coming-of-age exploration of queer desire. The way those are being so starkly put side by side, that feels like a real choice. And I can very much intellectually respond, I think, to what this movie is getting at. You know, the main concept seems to be to treat the toll of being closeted and sexually repressed as a type of psychological and physical horror, which as a concept, I can really dig. I do dig it as a concept. But I found, and this is where I'm really curious to hear what you think, I found the execution of the character work to be really underdeveloped, that I just felt really emotionally distant from the whole thing. And I really struggled with that. And so that's why I feel less, I think, enthusiastic about it than I wish I did.
Yeah. I mean, I fucking love this film.
I can tell.
It's almost like you have the bends while you're watching it. And that's what it feels coming of age in general, especially through a queer lens. Wait, two things. I want to address the idea of horror, which is not a word that I ever thought of in conversation with this film. I guess there is that moment where she's like taking her fingernail polish off, but I never thought of it as horror, especially not body horror. There's no gore, there's no blood. We have the red, and I love that you're using the word horror, because I think that the way that red was used symbolically and as a motif was meant to have a very specific response. In an interview with Oakley, she talked about how she wanted to use red in every scene where our protagonist was experiencing desire. And prior to having read that, I read the red as a symbol of, I don't know why I'm trying to say it in a smarter way, but of menstruation, of blood, which Oakley also talks about. It was meant to be this very blatant representation of blood. Those aren't her exact words, but she does use the word blood, right? But also in the film, when she is around women, so there are also two older women in this film. There's Shirley and April. April is an elderly woman who ends up being lost on the beach. She ends up being found by Ruth, our main character. And in the scenes where we have April, there is no red. In the scenes where we have Shirley, there is no red. In the scenes that we have Kippa, who's a 10-year-old girl, there's also no red. And so I was like, oh, because these are women that are either pre or post menstruation. The red comes like this idea of not only desire, but of experiencing desire for the first time, or starting to understand your own desire, which is so confusing. And it's often overlooked as a part of coming of age, I think, is the idea of desire. Like I feel like we talk a lot about attraction, but what do we find desirable? Which I think is different than attraction.
Yes. Just upon hearing you say that, I'm inclined to agree with you, but I'm curious how you would articulate them as being different.
Well, I think you can find something attractive on a pretty superficial level. On a surface level, I can be like, oh, I think this thing is attractive, or that's an attractive person. But do I desire them? That's different. I don't always desire things or people that I find attractive.
Desire involves you wanting to be an active participant somehow.
Yeah, and not necessarily sexually, right? Maybe even intellectually. I desire to know more. I desire to be around. There's something about desire that also turns back onto the self, right? Attraction is very outward looking. This person is attractive, but desire is like, how does this person make me feel? What is it sending back to me? And so the idea of red is very much about desire, but also about coming towards understanding how are we responding to the world around us, really.
See, I didn't even think about the color red, but I read a different interview with Oakley where she talked about how she first conceived of this movie as a short film, and she was involved at some film lab where they're workshopping each other's stuff. I think it was still at the script stage then. And some guy in the workshop, when he was giving her feedback, told her that it felt very overtly queer, like it was about this emerging desire that this one character had for this other girl. And she said that at the time, she was not thinking about it like that. She was in a relationship with a man, had never even considered herself to be queer. And then, and him saying that, it struck a nerve with her. And she then eventually developed it into a full feature and is now married to a woman. And so the process of making the movie helped her understand her own desire better, which I think is so beautiful and is the apex of what art is able to do, not just for the viewers, but for the people who make it. And so any questions or qualms I might have about this movie, I'm not trying to devalue that experience that she had in any way or say that the project was therefore unsuccessful, because obviously it was successful for her because it helped her reach this new level of self-actualization.
I just think at the end of the day, what I like about this movie is what kind of turns you away from it, which makes sense to me, knowing what we're inclined to create. I tend to write in the abstract, and when I'm not using abstraction, the threads that I am tying together are very loose. I'm expecting the reader, the audience, to do a lot of work on their own. And to me, that's where the meaning is really made. It's an active participation between the reader and the writer, between the audience and the viewer, leaving it open enough for me to say, this is what this means to me. This is the kind of meaning I want to hold in this moment from this art. And not to say that that isn't true, though, in the way that you create. But I definitely get down with some very surreal and more atmospheric spaces.
I mean, I don't have any questions whatsoever about the more surreal elements of the movie. I'm not fixated on what was she actually seeing, what wasn't she seeing. I watch enough horror movies that's just part of the deal of watching them. I think for me, it was more that I don't have a sense of who Ruth is outside of she spends a lot of the movie unhappy and struggling, and then eventually, after struggling a lot, she's finally able to break through and reach a new place of understanding. I have no sense of who she is as a person outside of this very specific plot the movie has placed her in. That's where my emotional distance comes in.
That's what I was getting at outside of the surreal elements, this idea of characterization and how atmospheric it really is. We don't really know who Ruth is, but neither does she until the end, when she has this realization of, holy shit, she has no idea who she is in that relationship with Tom the entire time. I've been in relationships like that where I don't say anything. The other person doesn't know me at all. And if you were an audience watching, you also would have no idea who I am, what I'm actually interested in. I have lived that moment that Ruth is living. And I have watched the partner that I'm with be the audience. They really don't know who I am, except for outside of whatever plot they've created for me. And so I really feel like that was purposeful. This is a film of coming of age, but mostly what we're getting is like the coming towards, not the what happens once you get there. That was the most striking part of the film for me.
I will say a moment I found really effective, and I wanted more moments like this, was when Jade and Ruth were talking in Jade's apartment. And I can't remember if this was the same conversation when Jade does Ruth's nails or if it's a different one. I think it's the second one, when they're drinking and Ruth gets sick and then they're dancing and there's lots of tension and it seems like maybe they're gonna kiss, and then Ruth panics and leaves. And starting that conversation, she reveals that he's 18 and she and Tom have been together for 3 years. And Jade doesn't really say anything. And Ruth takes a beat and then says, most people are impressed by that. And I love that moment because it does, in that one line, showcase the sort of weight of these heteronormative expectations under which she has been living. Because the idea that most people you encounter are impressed by the fact that you've been with the same guy since you were 15, and now you're technically an adult because you're 18 and you're building your adult life together. Of course, you're going to feel like, well, this must be the right thing to do then. If every other adult I tell this to is impressed by the fact that this is the way my life is currently going. And it made perfect sense to me how that would subsume her and make her feel so unsure of who she is.
The way that Jade responds to that too, in the moment where she's like, well, I'm not most people. And then she recognizes the pretentiousness in her saying that. Yeah. And then she starts mocking herself. Right. Like, I'm not most people. I think that's a crucial moment. This is what is so irritating about the log line, right, is because Tom is an afterthought. His name's Tom, right?
Yeah.
That's what brings her to the beach. That's what brings her to this caravan park, this trailer park. But ultimately, it's the conversations she's having with these women and the interactions that she has with them that are transformative for her. It has nothing really to do. And it's so... I just had this thought. Didn't plan on talking about this, so it's not...
And your glee on your face. I'm excited to hear it.
Because it lets us talk about Richard. It means we have to talk about Richard Dillard. Okay, so we had a wonderful professor named Richard Dillard, and he very sadly passed away pretty shortly before our graduation. Marin and I did take one of his classes together. What was that class called?
It was called Advanced Studies of the Novel. And then he added his own subtitle that was called... Oh, it had alliteration.
Disturbances?
Something and disturbances.
Shit. Okay. Something and disturbances. Yeah. Shit. Whatever. Anyway, it was like all these disturbing novels, not necessarily disturbing, but whatever this other D word is that we cannot remember.
I know I still have that syllabus buried somewhere in my files too.
He had us read this novel called The Glass Key.
Oh, The Glass Key.
By Dashiell Hammett.
Dashiell Hammett.
Okay. Richard Dillard fucking loved Dashiell Hammett. And we were all like, well, I don't know. Not everyone. I was like, I don't know if I like this book.
I was less than enthusiastic.
Because the entire thing is outward. There's no interiority.
None.
Except for one moment where we get a little glimpse into the female...
I just remembered what the other were.
What is it?
Discomforts and disturbances. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I don't want to lose it.
No, I love it. And so this film was doing that. If you're looking for characterization, which is through getting more glimpses into their interiority and what they're thinking, we don't get that in this film. But what we do get is her conversations, very brief conversations with other women. And that's mostly where her character is being built. So, for example, when she talks to Shirley, who runs the park, right? Shirley tells her the sea is a healer. And then she decides to go into the water. Yeah. She has Jade do her nails for her. Jade does say, oh, that's my favorite too, when she picks out a certain red color. And so then Jade chooses that one. Her character is being built in conversation with other women. And in some ways, she's allowing these other women to help her figure out who she is and to build her character and to have new experiences. She's trying things on. She's taking them off. She puts on the red nails. She ends up removing them. So there isn't that interiority that we would expect from a film with such sparseness. And that's so, you would think, dependent on character development.
I love that you brought up The Glass Key, because the thing I remember Richard saying about it, which was why he thought it was such a genius novel, is because he said that he thought it was the most objective novel ever written in terms of no interiority. And so when I think of the word objective, I naturally think of its opposite, subjective. And I think this film is incredibly subjective. So it's interesting to hear you say that you don't think she has a lot of interiority, because I've often thought interiority and subjectiveness go hand in hand. But this idea that this film is incredibly subjective in that we are always in her point of view. She's in practically every single shot of this movie, Ruth is. We are seeing the world as she is seeing it. So the idea that it can be incredibly subjective while also still not providing us that interiority we might expect is just a really challenging conundrum. And I went into this conversation knowing I was probably going to feel cooler on this movie than you.
I didn't think that you were going to be on board with this film the way that I am from the get-go.
I know that I like some freaky shit.
I know, but this isn't freaky.
all of the stray hair freaked me out.
Hair
When I say
is
body,
kind of gross.
when I say body horror, I'm mostly talking about all the shots of stray hair.
It's literally just hair.
But
Is there any other moments besides the hair and besides her taking off her nails?
Jade's given her acrylic nails, right?
Yeah.
And she's using a knife to scrape them off. Well, even before she uses the knife to scrape them off, instead of putting the acetone on a cotton ball and rubbing the polish off nail by nail, she just pours it into a cup and puts her hand in there. And even that, to me, there was something repulsive about that, because then the acetone just becomes soaked with red, or it absorbs all the red. That scene when she, and this is one of the ones where I'm not sure, did she actually see that? But she hears the women having sex in the shower, and we see her watching them from below the stall. The women who are having sex, one of them at least has very long nails, and she draws blood on the other woman's thigh. And the music is very tense, and the way that Ruth is peering at them and the look on her face, it all felt very horror to me, almost, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's very intriguing. It is horrifying to figure out who you are,
That's true.
because once you have figured it out, you reach this point of no return where it's like, okay, now I know who I am. I can either choose to live who I am or live a lie. And live with the knowledge that I am denying myself something. The idea that this moment could potentially be horrifying for her makes sense to me in a way that's really smart. When I say that there's things about this movie that feel horror infused or body horror adjacent, those are some that come to mind.
I totally do not read that scene as body horror. It's just sex. I didn't see any aspect of horror in it, and she was just curious, and it was like her realizing in that moment as she's watching these two women that this is something she finds desirable, and that scares her. But I don't think that the scene itself is meant to be horrifying in the sense that she's supposed to be afraid of what she's seeing. But this film, because it is operating on this plane of subjectivity, where you see horror, I'm going to see good sex. I guess is maybe, but I think that the idea of the red nails and her soaking them in the acetone didn't strike me as horrific either, because Jade hasn't just painted her nails, she has acrylics on there, like it's gel. So if you ever had your nails done, you have to soak it, otherwise it won't come off.
Okay.
And then if you don't have a tool,
know anything about getting your nails
it's
done.
fine. And then if you're just doing it at home, you're probably just going to use a knife to scrape off that polish. So the way that I, read it is like she got too close to this desire, and then she had to remove it with whatever tools she had available to her.
But isn't that kind of just what great horror does, in that it takes these things which are everyday? It's like the way writers love to talk about defamiliarization. It's the idea that something which is practical, as you're pointing out, using a knife in this strictly as a tool of utility, can still strike a chord of unease
If it feels unfamiliar to you. Yes. But it felt familiar to me. Those scenes felt familiar to me.
That's so interesting.
So I didn't respond to them in the same way, which is making me love this movie even more.
It is forging an identity unapologetically with the various elements that it is bringing together that you usually would not expect a film to bring together. I almost wished it was longer, just so I had a little more time to marinate in Ruth's journey. I think I needed more scenes of her and Jade together. And maybe it's just because that's obviously the most tender aspect of the movie. And every time Tom showed up, I was like, oh, here we go again. I'm about to be sad or uncomfortable or angry. And I don't know. Basically, I wish that girls could just fuck off and have their own lesbian utopias without men if they wanted to. That was what I wanted to see. But that's not what this movie is.
There not being more scenes with just her and Jade is also true to her experience, because she can't spend more time with Jade, again, because of Tom.
Right.
Because Tom and then Kai, this violent man, is fucking creepy, asshole dude. So we have the German Shepherd, and like the German Shepherd's barking at Ruth. And then he says the reason that the dog is barking at her is because the dog can smell her cunt. There's something threatening in the way that he's using that language. Kai and Tom do end up fighting. It's really towards the end of the film. They end up getting in a fight because we assume Kai has said something to Tom about how Ruth seems to be potentially enthralled by Jade, which is true. And there was also a scene where Jade and Ruth are talking to each other, and Ruth is like, I'm gonna go. Kai's watching, and Jade's like, I don't care. Mm-hmm. And Ruth's like, I'm gonna go. We don't get more of those tender moments because they're not available to Ruth because of the violent men that she's surrounded by. And they're very like, their violence is very subtle. It's very just under the skin. Oh, but then there's that moment where she ends up going into the water. She goes and visits Tom at work, and we see her staring at the workbench type area. And she looks up on the wall, and there are all these images of topless or nearly topless women, but none of them have heads. They're all headless women because their heads have been not cut off physically, but cut off aesthetically, which is how women are often represented sexually, right? Where it's just these body parts. And we get this great scene where Ruth is just staring at those depictions of women. And again, we don't get any interiority. We don't know what she's thinking. But the very next scene is her with Jade.
And I think that next scene with Jade is the one that I referenced earlier, where they're drinking and dancing, and it seems like they're going to maybe kiss, and then Ruth runs away.
It is that in that scene where Ruth says that she's been feeling a bit strange. That's her saying, I've been feeling a bit not straight, to sort of simplify it. But I really want to talk about the red hair and what's happening with that.
Okay.
Ruth is seeing these red hairs everywhere. She's also seeing lipstick prints. She sees those a couple of times, which are reddish. And we have so many moments of red in this film. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to tell you some of the moments of red, just so you get an idea of how often they really are. So the propane tanks attached to all the trailers. There's a discarded pair of like apron or overalls laid out in the seagrass. Fire hydrants. There's some decorative wall plaque. Red nails, Ruth's, Jade's, and this mystery woman. A life jacket on the wall. Fire buckets on a pole. Faded red curtain that Ruth is taking down in one of the scenes. Ruth's red bra that she wears when she goes into the sea. And then there are red hooks on all the shower stalls as well. And Oakley did mention that the red that came from seeing all of the, I think they're propane tanks. Now I feel stupid if they're not, but I assume that's what they are, is that those were already there. And so that made her want to use that in a different way, if I'm remembering correctly. And then in moments when other things are happening, she'll see this tangle of red hair. And then there's this somewhat climactic moment where she's in the sea and she almost drowns. And there's red hair. And it seems like it's hers, but it's like wrapping itself around her. And then in the final scene, her and Tom don't have a conversation directly where she's saying, I'm not attracted to you. We also get that sense right in the beginning where they're about to have sex and she says, I have to go brush my teeth. But then she goes in the bathroom and masturbates herself for a moment before she comes back out. We already had questions about her desire, or at least his ability to make her feel desire. I feel like that's how we were supposed to interpret that scene. That's not commentary on how you experience pleasure, by the way, before or after sex, whatever you need to do. But this was purposeful and meaningful in this context. We get this scene where the hair is wrapping around her. She almost drowns. She doesn't drown. She comes out of the water. And that's where she has this like, I'm coming into myself. She has this fight with Tom. She goes to Jade's. Jade isn't there. She goes to Jade's. And she puts on a wig with red hair, and she dresses up and then goes to the beach, and Jade's there, and they make out, and et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of her becoming all of the red hair that she's been seeing. There was also a moment where she sees a hand with red nails kind of slide around a corner or something. She ends up having red nails for a moment, right? We can tell that she's thinking Tom's cheating on her with someone with red hair, just like the log line tells us. But at the end, we never get a really clear answer necessarily on who had the red hair. This is what I think it is, which is this idea of, well, hold on. I'm going to use one of these texts because this is where I'm getting this term. It's being applied in a much different way in this essay. This book is a book of essays called Magical Realism, Essays on Music, Memory, Fantasy, and Borders. She's talking about how first generation American children end up being the keepers of memory, language, culture, obligated to maintain ties to a home country and distant family we barely know. And then she goes on to say, within, there is a deep split in consciousness, a rift between two identities, two lands growing ever apart as time goes on. The more American I become, the farther away my Mexican identity feels. So what emerges between the two selves is a secret self, a third self, one allowed to live without the burden of either identity. This is the self that fantasy engages. For culturally alienated children, this secret third self, the fantasy self, the displaced self, the forbidden self, the self not identified by others from the outside, is the avatar self, the self free from outside projection. So the way that I end up interpreting the red hair, which I didn't really have a phrase for it, such a concrete phrase for it until I read that essay, which the essay itself is all the Atreus at the Sphinx Gate, which if you've ever seen the Neverending Story, that's what it references. But applying the idea of a third self to the experience of queerness and queer coming of age, I think also works. I read the red hair, the red nails, all of these clues about another person ends up being just this third self that emerges, right? From her experiences as an adolescent, as she moves towards womanhood. And then in the other sense, moving from this very heteronormative way of thinking and experiencing desire towards queerness. And so from that, this third self emerges that is both queer and whatever version of like feminine or woman we see being represented. That was really beautiful to me. There's another text I want to talk about too.
Okay. I agree with that interpretation of the red hair person.
Yeah, I was going to ask the other text that I think not necessarily talks about this idea of a third self emerging so much as the movement of multiple selves is a book by an essay by T. Fleischmann called Syzygy Beauty, which, to give you a summary really quick, Fleischmann's Syzygy Beauty, an essay, is a book built on binaries as they are transgressed. The word syzygy itself meaning a kind of oppositional pairing, astronomical coupling of the sun and moon, gendered associations of male-female combinations in Gnosticism, which is the Gnostic Gospels were the books that weren't included in the Bible, where the concept of how you reach divinity is much different than the way we would have been taught via modern day Catholicism, which is that you should seek God and you can come to know God through an inner knowing. So it's much more like meditative and inner looking. And I think that this entire essay does that really well. It's this really poetic rendering of a relationship that is wavering, that is distant. I think that the way that this film creates meaning through its atmosphere is very similar to what is happening in this text. There's like one paragraph on each page and they're very poetically rendered. I feel like I could pick any one of these and it will make sense and I can make the connection. So I'm just going to do that. This is on page 97. I try to explain to my friend why we haven't all been together, at least once, to consider. I want to say that being alone is the only truth our bodies offer us, that this is the reason the dancers don't discriminate between flesh. They all fall. What else is there to do? The sky is big, bleary, dark, just like it has always been, no matter which way it all is moving. You have those stars on your ceiling, the ones that glow and are green. You are beautiful every night. When something seems like it is always true, someone must come along, reach into her body, and read one more story from a scroll. This passage works well because I did want to talk about how even though she has this moment of coming towards her truest self with Jade, ultimately the film ends with her alone in the sea, which is very similar to the way our protagonist in The Starling Girl ends, where she's alone dancing in the bar. The freedom, and it's not as if she's liberated from straightness into queerness. She's liberated into this third self that is beyond those kinds of binaries. And so when Fleischmann says, I want to say that being alone is the only truth our bodies offer us, that this is the reason the dancers don't discriminate between flesh. If we consider that to be true, when something seems like it is always true, someone must come along, reach into her body, and read one more story from a scroll, which I think is also exemplified in that last scene, where we get the sense as an audience that this is not an ending for Ruth, right? This is the beginning.
That relates perfectly to what I want to talk about, which is The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which I know is admittedly a very heterosexual novel. But the sea is so important in that book. I initially wanted to talk about that book when we did our episode on The Lost Daughter. I reread it to talk about it when we talked about The Lost Daughter, because a big part of that book is about this mother experiencing emotional crisis and realizing that she became a mother too young before she knew who she was. And so in that sense, it felt like a very natural companion to The Lost Daughter, plus the connection to she's on the sea, and it is this harbinger for her experiencing new things and realizing things about herself. But then when I watched this movie, and the sea is so important in this movie, and they use the word sea. Mm-hmm. It's all over the place, as it is in The Awakening. And so I just kept thinking about it. The Awakening, if you haven't read it or aren't familiar with it, is this book published in 1899, so it's very old. And it is about this woman named Edna. She is upper class. She is 28. She's married with 2 young children. And when she and her family are on holiday on the coast, she realizes all these things about herself in terms of she comes into her own desire, much to the way Ruth does. And part of that involves her feeling sexual desire for a man who is not her husband, but part of that is also this intellectual and physical desire just for freedom to be on her own. And so it's a very short novel, and it was very, very controversial when it was first published. And I would like to read this passage from it and then talk about, relate it to what you're saying specifically about beginnings and endings. In short, Edna was beginning to realize her position in the universe as a human being, and to recognize her relations as an individual to the world within and about her. This may seem like a ponderous weight of wisdom to descend upon the soul of a young woman of 28, perhaps more wisdom than the Holy Ghost is usually pleased to vouchsafe to any woman. But the beginning of things, of a world especially, is necessarily vague, tangled, chaotic, and exceedingly disturbing. How few of us ever emerge from such beginning? How many souls perish in its tumult? The voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander for a spell in abysses of solitude, to lose itself in mazes of inward contemplation. The voice of the sea speaks to the soul. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. I was fixated specifically on this notion of beginnings. The idea that it is so hard to survive a beginning because, spoiler, for a book that's 125 years old. At the end of the novel, Edna is so profoundly unhappy with her life that she returns to the sea and drowns herself in the sea. And so that is how the book ends, with this woman's broken dreams and the wish to no longer be alive. And so the sea becomes this place of danger and despair, where throughout most of the book, the sea was this place of escape and discovery for her. Because something that happens in the book, just like in this movie, is that she learns how to swim. Edna learns how to swim, just like Ruth learns how to swim. In that passage, the book is foreshadowing the fact that, yes, she is having this profound beginning, but will she survive it? Probably not. And in this movie, similarly, we see Ruth embark on this beginning. Mm-hmm. And I just, in comparing The Awakening to Makeup, I did feel this little glimmer of hope, because we have progressed in such a way that Ruth is allowed to survive her beginning. And the movie also understands how important that beginning is. That the entire movie is the beginning, as you put so astutely earlier. I think that is unqualifiably good. And I am glad for that. Because when The Awakening was written, it was written at a time where I'm sure if Kate Chopin wrote a character who expressed ambivalence towards her children and wished to not be their mother anymore and wished to have sex with someone who wasn't her husband, they would not publish that book if she did not kill that character at the end. I'm just glad that now women who are having their beginnings at the sea are able to see that through.
I think that's such a great point. Also, I'm feeling like such an idiot now for thinking about The Awakening, and I had never considered that there wasn't really another option as far as how to end that novel by having her survive. Because by having her kill herself, you could have reviewers say, well, she felt so guilty about the choices she made, and this was her only way out. Mm-hmm. When a feminist reading of it, which is the way Chopin meant it to be read, was the weight of the expectations on her as a woman, where she didn't want to live with them anymore. Yeah, I think that's a hopeful comparison. What I like about thinking about it in comparison to The Starling Girl as well is we talked about in that episode how Jem, in the end, she didn't end up going in the pool in like the final scene because she didn't need a baptism, right? She needed something else to liberate herself. So that's why she went to the bar and danced. And the way that I feel like so often when we see someone like go into the water, we're meant to understand it, even if there isn't a strong underpinning of religiosity. I think the word baptism still comes to mind. But in this scene, it does not feel like that to me. It does not feel like she's washing anything away. It feels like the sea has been transformative for her. Mm-hmm. And she now, this third self, like I mentioned, has truly emerged. And so that is another testament to what great filmmaking and this kind of story that can be told through visual language, almost purely visual language. And for the ways in which I see myself in that character, I just feel like I understand her so well, despite the lack of interiority. But what I understand is the plot that she's been given and how she's able to escape it. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem like the right word, though. To defy it. Thinking now about the Ever After tagline.
That's Ever After tagline might be a better tagline for this movie.
I was literally just thinking that.
And I think you mentioned this earlier. The word I really take umbrage with is obsession.
Yeah.
Obviously now, in 2024, we use that word pretty casually to be like, oh, I'm obsessed with that band or whatever, and we know there's not any nefarious intent behind that. But generally, we talk about obsession. A person being obsessed is stalker adjacent or something. And so I think it really misrepresents what Ruth is experiencing in a way.
And in this context too, because of how the log line, like in conversation with the log line, using the word obsession feels very gendered.
Oh, yeah.
Like, oh, she's obsessed with finding out who her boyfriend's cheating on her with. Yeah. If you have entered into a social contract with someone, like a monogamous social contract, and you think they're sleeping with somebody else, you can be obsessed with finding out the way in which you've been betrayed by this person who is supposed to hold up their end of the bargain. And not that it's the worst thing in the world you can do.
Cheating.
Yeah. There are worse things in the world. I'm just saying you have this social contract and the other person has a right to know whether or not you have adhered to it.
Can I say one thing that's related to what you just said that I'm just now thinking of?
Yeah, because I have one more question, but it's not necessarily related to
Okay.
go on.
Because as I was watching it, and I was like, oh, okay, this movie isn't really about Tom possibly cheating on her. That's just a vehicle for us to get to where we're really going. I was just like, why is he even here? Obviously, I know why he's there. But I was just thinking about, why is this the vehicle by which we are getting to our actual destination? And the more I think about it, it makes sense to me. This idea that if he was cheating on her and he was exploring that desire in whatever way he wanted to, without any consideration for the social contract that has been put in place, and she has been conversely restricting herself of her own desires as a way to appease him, to be with him, then like, hell yeah, I'd be so fucking pissed.
Yeah. She came all the way down.
She was on a bus all day to get there.
And the first thing Shirley asks when she gets there, because Shirley's the first person she encounters, is Shirley asks Ruth, are you allowed to be here? Do your parents know you're here? And she's like, yeah. But we already get the sense that's not true.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like, she's totally snuck down, but she's also just recently turned 18. She's lying. She's risking. She's taking a risk to be there. A big one.
Yeah. Because it's not the fact that she loves him so much and wants to be with him so much that him cheating on her is what's hurtful. I interpret it as the fact that he is just potentially so blatantly following his desires on whatever whim he wants, and she has not been allowed to do that. That is where I think her fixation on the girl with the red hair makes a lot of sense to me. And obviously there's multiple layers to the fixation on the girl with the red hair, as we've talked about with the third selves and stuff. But that just came to me.
But also, I'm sorry, I can't believe we didn't talk about this, but I do actually think that it's very likely Tom is cheating on her.
I mean, he's
like in conjunction with...
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe.
It's not clear, but I think it feels likely to me because, like, where was he when she first got there? And then when she tries to talk to him about it, he's like, you're pissing me off. And anytime she tries to have a real conversation about her feelings, and this also feels true to this lack of characterization, is what anytime she does assert herself, the men she speaks, Tom, really, it's just Tom, fucking Tom, shoots her down.
Yeah.
You know? And so, yeah, she tries to bring it up with him, and the way that he avoids it makes me think, because I believe it's on two different occasions where she tries to have a conversation about it, and he changes the subject. He finds ways to change the subject instead of just addressing it. So if your partner comes to you and is like, are you cheating on me? And you're not, you should be really concerned with how are you behaving in that relationship and how is that person feeling? Why would that person think that? Maybe it has something to do with them and something they've dealt with in the past. I don't know, but I feel like oftentimes the crux of the blame is put on the person who's asking rather than why do they think that though? Mm-hmm. And in this case, let's say she never found the red hair. Tom is not exactly a present and engaging partner.
No.
So
he made that weird spaghetti sandwich at the beginning of the movie, and I was like, I don't know what this dude's deal is. Though in all fairness, at the end of the movie, she did make a meal that was just plain pasta.
I feel like she was pissed. Well, I think that she did that because she wasn't feeling desire, so there couldn't be red sauce.
Oh, that's true.
That's how I read that.
But
yeah.
wait, this is the second day she's there, because she gets there really late at night, so it's the next day, and he makes spaghetti for dinner, and there's red sauce on it. And he puts the pasta with the sauce on a hoagie bun? And then, so the linguine is hanging down, and it's so messy, and it just... That was also horror to me.
I mean, I can't say I've never eaten spaghetti that way. I definitely have. My family would. But I noted it on there. The way that he is eating, though, is disgusting. There's something so... I think we're meant to be grossed out by him because he's licking his fingers just so much.
Yeah.
And in the same moment be like, you're pissing me off. And then just, it's so...
Yeah.
He's kind of repulsive. She's trying to have an adult conversation and he's eating and acting like a child.
And when he's wearing slides with shorts, again, this is just me being judgmental of people's fashion choices now, but the polo with the shorts and the slide sandals, he might have socks with them.
I don't think I really noticed what he was wearing.
I was like, I understand why she's not attracted to him. I'm anti-horny right now looking at him. I'm just being mean now.
No, it's okay. What I would feel fair saying is that you would think his wardrobe would be in one of those memes that was like such and such starter pack.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and I don't know exactly what the starter pack is, but it's there. Like there's something I can't quite grasp.
His apartment, especially once you see his apartment and then later you see Jade's apartment, which is so... Jade's apartment is so lived in and colorful and it feels like a home. And then his is so like sterile and no personality whatsoever. That made me think about memes I've seen about the apartments of men who live alone, where they have a single chair and the TV on the ground in the living room and there's nothing on the walls and it's mostly empty. Obviously, those production design choices are meant to highlight something about the distinction between these two characters and how Ruth sees the two of them. Mm-hmm. But, like, there is something, I don't know, there's, like, real-world implications, I guess, to this. And I know I'm operating within a binary here, but this often kind of female desire to cultivate warm, lively space. Versus, why don't men want to buy furniture and furnish their apartments?
Dude, I'm sure there is real discourse on this. But yeah, there is a stereotype of like men just having the mattress.
I am fully leaning into stereotypes.
And women taking more time to cultivate a space. But also, I think that this is tied to girlhood bedroom culture where we create a safe space in our bedrooms because that's where we're safe. Whereas men, okay, I'm going to throw a mattress on the fucking floor. I'm going to feel just as comfortable on that as I do walking alone at night. Mm-hmm. They don't have to create a retreat from the world because they don't have to retreat from the world.
Yes.
You know?
That is, I think, what I was tapping into.
Yeah.
You articulated it very well. You said you had another question.
It's about the term straight baiting, which I had never heard before. I know queer baiting, but I never had heard it. I've never heard it used in that sense. And I am curious, like...
I think it's a term people use. Or maybe straight washing is another way people say it. But it's burying the lead of the queerness of a specific work in either the poster or the way you cut a trailer or the way you write the blurb on the back of the book, stuff like that.
If we're placing a value judgment on this idea of... Because I know I have opinions about queer baiting, where you're trying to engage a queer audience when, in fact, it's really... Whatever the creation is that is at hand is actually upholding heteronormative ideologies. I guess what I'm asking is, like, straight baiting bad, though? For the most part, so much of our media is already straight. Is it really baiting when it's just representing the majority of the media that already exists in order to potentially attract people who would not otherwise be confronted? Or is it acting as an erasure of queerness?
I've always viewed it as the latter.
Okay.
The implicit message, or maybe it's not even implicit, but explicit, is that if you feel you need to hide the queerness in order to get people's asses in theater seats, then you are inherently ashamed or uncomfortable, ashamed of the art that has been made or uncomfortable with it. And that feels rooted in a deep place of homophobia, I would say.
Yeah. And probably also in capitalism.
Yeah,
right?
that
There's many people to buy into this as possible. Yeah. And so, okay. Yeah, it's just not a term like I had heard before, so I was just curious.
Should I ask you our question?
Yeah.
What does this movie make you want to tell your younger self?
My very first thought was that I would tell myself to trust herself, to rise to the occasion. What I mean by that is, hold on, I actually need to reference this really quick. I didn't mean to do this, but it's in the same essay from Magical/Realism, because I'm pulling that phrase from this essay, and so I want to give credit to where this thought is even coming from. She's talking about how film and media has changed, specifically for children in the 90s, and how different it is now. And so she says this: now my son is in charge of the family content. As I sit down to watch Disney Plus with him today, my attention wanders. After 15 minutes, my brain turned into soup as it's bombarded with zero-stakes special effects. And it is indeed a marvel how the heroes of today's family films are better looking than ever, but somehow sexless, empty, anodyne, safe, lost in the spectacle and speed of capital. Something has been lost in all that precision, the heart of the fantasy itself. She references specifically this moment in the film The Neverending Story, where there are these two giant Sphinx statues that Atreyu, the hero, has to run through before they shoot lasers at him. And the Sphinxes have bare breasts. And so she says, like other fantasy films of the time, The Neverending Story trusted children to handle the strangeness of Sphinx's bare breasts. Their nudity was never contextualized as erotic, but as an encounter with something ancient, arcane, powerful, and mysterious. And then she goes on to say, they were made not necessarily movies back then with a family in mind, but rather on their own terms, with complicated themes, terrifying imagery, and strong language, an open invitation for children to rise to the occasion. Okay, so this is where it's coming from. It's maybe a loose thread, but it certainly is connected. When we're consuming media, we aren't expected to create our own meaning from it necessarily, depending on that media, especially media for when you were younger. And while maybe there was a grittiness to those films in the 90s that did trust, or at least give children and adolescents the opportunity to rise to the occasion, wasn't always the case. I was still being fed images that were meant to solidify my expectations for who I could become, or how I was meant to interpret the world, how I was meant to experience desire, how I was meant to experience pleasure and attraction. There was so much uncertainty around that as I was coming of age. I couldn't name desire for myself. I couldn't tell you, this is how I experience pleasure. This is what I know to be desirable. Because the world hadn't trusted me to rise to the occasion to figure it out for myself. And so if I could go back in time, I would just say, live your life like you're a film from the 90s, I guess is what I'm saying. A film made for children in the 90s that expected you to really have to contend with your own thoughts and feelings.
I also want to talk about feelings, which I guess we're always talking about feelings on the show, because you and I are both highly feeling people, I think. But I love the moment in this movie when Ruth is picking out which color she wants her nails to be. she's going through Jade's collection of nail polishes and trying to pick which color. And Jade sees her sort of hesitating, and Jade says, "It's not about how it looks, it's about how it makes you feel." And so Ruth heeds that advice, and then she picks the red, which, as we have established, very important color. And I think something I would tell my younger self, and something I still struggle with, is how to acknowledge how I feel. I have, throughout the course of my life, carried a lot of shame and guilt and anxiety about things pertaining to sex and sexuality and desire. And some of that has been grappled with, and some of it maybe could be grappled with more. Because when Jade says that to Ruth, think about how it makes you feel, she means it in this positive way. Think about how good it makes you feel. And that is important, and I'm glad that she said that. But also, it is a necessity to sit with what makes you feel bad, too. Yeah. Which is much less fun work. Though sometimes it's scary to admit something makes you feel good. And so I think I would tell my younger self that one day she will understand the necessity of grappling with what makes her feel bad, as well as what makes her feel good. And that they are both equally important things to do.
Yeah, that was great. I feel like maybe that was the culmination of what I was trying to say.
Thank you for picking this movie. I'm really glad that I got to talk about it with you. Regardless of how I feel about any given movie, I'm always going to be glad to talk about it with you.
Yeah, no, same. And I am going to keep choosing these very subjective, character-driven, minus conventional methods of characterization films for us to watch together.
And that's great. Because if anything, you're just going to get other people to watch them. So
I hope so. I would love to.
You should get your dad to watch this one.
No. Dude, no. You know what? You know what I'm thinking about?
He can handle Black Swan.
I don't know if we're going to keep this in, but I'm going to tell it now. Sorry. I saw Black Swan in theaters with my dad. Okay? And he doesn't sit like next to you in a theater. Like, he'll sit like in a different chair, like in a different row. He just likes his space, so he can throw popcorn at his face. And in a very sexy scene, my father, instead of just letting it happen, you know, like obviously weird to see with your daughter, he had to say aloud over and over as the sex is happening, "Oh, great movie to see with your daughter. Great movie to see with your daughter." Oh, so loud in the movie theater. And the thing is, there were other people in there, and they didn't even know that I was his daughter. They didn't even know like I was there with him. So they probably just thought he's a weird guy announcing to the theater that they shouldn't come see this film with their daughter. So no, Marin, I'm not gonna watch. I'm not gonna tell my dad to watch this. And I'm definitely not gonna watch it with him. Oh.
Okay.
You know what? Now I'm going to. Just so on our next episode, I can be like, these are my dad's reviews. And you can take that part out.
Okay. Got it.
Or leave it on. It's okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please follow us on your podcast listening platform of choice. Turn on post notifications so that way you don't ever miss an episode. Also, we would love it if you gave us 5 stars. We are slowly accruing 5-star ratings, but we would love more. So if the spirit moves you, please give us 5 stars. If you want to give us less stars, maybe just keep your stars to yourself. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that caveat.
Oh, check the show notes for the secondary text we reference. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at Tell Me I'm Sorry and email us your own musings and questions at tellmeimsorry@gmail.com.
You can follow me on Letterboxd at Marin Harrington.
And you can follow me on Instagram at _Saint_Margaret_.
I am Marin.
And I'm Maggie.
And you've been listening to Tell Me I'm Sorry.
Yes, you have.
and you thought we were done because we have been talking for a very long time.
It's true. It's going on 2 hours. So.
But we are not done because we believe in epilogues in this podcast, as we all should. And I get to tell Maggie what movie we're watching next, which I am very excited about. This is a movie, Maggie, that I have actually talked to you about before and talked to you about specifically in relation to this podcast. So the name might be familiar to you. It is a documentary that is on Netflix. It's a Netflix original that is called Shirkers. And I can't wait to talk about it.
I'm very excited. I've been wanting to watch it. I haven't watched it.
Okay.
So,
Well,
yeah.
I am super excited, and I hope that people listening watch it as well. Again, that is Shirkers on Netflix. It's a documentary from, I believe, 2018. And
How do you spell that?
Shirkers. So,
All right.
thank you so much, everybody, for listening.
Until next time.
Until next time.